Can you hear? Yes. You okay? Thank you for being here. I'm not into some of the things about Citizen United that the other presenters are, and all of you are. But what I hope to do is give you some context for how a democracy can respond to this huge problem that we're facing. In order to do that, I need to give you a very, very short, and I hope concise, look at what has happened to journalism and media and their interaction with politics that has brought us to the place that we find ourselves now. Journalists are better, if they're good at anything, are better at talking about what has happened than saying what's going to happen. And so I want to try to fill some background here, again, in the interest of helping us understand what our guidelines might be getting out of this mess that circumstances have put us in. Democracy has a question for us as citizens. And the question that democracy wants us to answer is, what shall we do? What shall we do about this? What shall we do about that? As a citizen group, as citizens in the community. The democratic dynamic that's behind that, and it helps us think about and act upon the idea of what shall we do, is a combination of three things. Shared, relevant information. An agora or a place to discuss the implications of that information. And some shared values, if only a belief in democracy itself. So those are the three elements, I think, that go into the democratic dynamic. Historically, in this country, and in a lot of other countries, but particularly this country for 150 years, newspapers provided two parts of that. Newspapers provided the shared information. You pick up a newspaper, and other people in the community are picking up that same newspaper. And whether the information is fully correct, whether it's biased or not, is not the point. The point is everybody has access to a certain set of facts and information that they can talk about and think about. The newspaper also provided the agora, the place, the gathering place, though it wasn't physical, but the gathering place where people could discuss the implications of this information. What do we do? How do we answer the question, what shall we do now that we have the information, kind of here, discuss it, toss it around, and try to decide. In the early days, that was the role that newspapers primarily played. Unfortunately, in one sense, newspapers were also a very, very lucrative business for the most part, except for the very earliest years. Up until the middle of the 70s, from the beginning of the country, in the middle of the 70s, newspapers were a very good way to make a good living. Most of the people in the early days who owned and ran newspapers weren't in it to make fortunes. Some of them did, but they weren't in it. They were in it, for the most part, out of a sense of obligation, without expressing it perhaps the way I did, but out of a sense of obligation to the community and to democracy. Into the post-World War II, well, pre-World War II, newspapers were making 35 and 40 and 45% operating returns. You had to be either very unlucky or pretty stupid not to make money with a newspaper. It wasn't that hard to do. At the end of World War II, and into the early 50s, every American family averaged reading 1.7 newspapers per family. In other words, most families read more than one newspaper. And again, people were making a lot of money producing those newspapers. But then a funny thing started to happen in the late 50s and early 60s called greed. And the owners of newspapers began to acquire more newspapers and form large corporations. They were called chain newspapers, you've heard the expression. The growth of the chains in the 50s and the 60s began to really change the way newspapers operated, and therefore the way newspapers had impact upon the community and upon the democratic process. It went on fine for a while. I was working for, in the late 50s and early 60s, was working for night newspapers, which was the second largest chain in the country. And they kept acquiring newspapers. And as chains like Knight and Ritter and Cox and Media General began to get large and wanted to acquire more newspapers, they did what companies do. They went public, sold stock to get the money to expand and make more money. There's nothing essentially wrong with that. But the problem for newspapers was that newspapers don't exist just to make money. They exist for the democratic reasons, or should, that I've mentioned. But the chains continue to grow. I remember when our company, night newspapers, went public, there was an editor's meeting right before the company actually went public. And Jack Knight, who founded the company and built it from one newspaper in Akron, Ohio, to 37 newspapers all over the country, said, told this editor's meeting, when you go public, you lose control of your destiny. But he was the president and chairman of the company, and he joined the other the other board members in voting to go public. At the same time, other newspaper chains were public. New York Times, which was a small group, Washington Post group. An important decision was made in the 60s that changed the whole thrust of the newspaper business. And that was when, not just going public, but when you went public, you had a choice of having all the voting shares held by the board members and the owners, or having general shares where all the shareholders had a vote. Knight, Ritter, Gannett, Cox, Ritter newspapers elected to have one tier of shares so that shareholders would have a vote, which was fine as long as shareholders in the company had the democratic interest of the newspaper at heart. But as we move into these public companies, began to move into the 70s and 80s, you began to get conglomerates, foundations who were only interested in the money that they could get and how they could increase the value of the shares. And so quality began to be sacrificed to increase profits in all of these companies. The interesting thing, though, if you look at the quality newspapers remaining today, and there are very few, Washington Post, New York Times, Dow Jones, the Wall Street Journal, were the ones who had only one tier of shares, so that the people who ran the company got to decide, well, we don't have to increase our profits this year. We'll be happy with what we're making. But that's, unfortunately, was not most newspapers, including night and night-winter newspapers. And the other big thing, I'm going to try to get to the end of this before time runs out. The major changes on Wall Street came with institutional investment firms. Again, people and institutions who bought shares and turned over shares rapidly just for the sake of the profit involved in it. And some problems in the way we practice journalism, some habits about objectivity and detachment, and emphasis on conflict, which began to drive citizens away from newspapers. And by 1994, 71% of the people polled by the Los Angeles Times poll had the opinion that the news media gets in the way of the nation solving its problems. Now, 71% in 1994. Now, citizens who don't have shared information and aren't engaged in acting on that information are not particularly useful citizens. And as our bad newspaper habits drove people out of interest in politics and sort of made them throw up their hands about politics, because we kept telling them politics is all about polar conflict, A to Z. And that just drove a lot of people out of the political arena. So, what we're faced with now, of course, is a whole new information environment in which everybody has access to almost everything. And the thing that concerns me the most about that for democracy is something I call the rutabaga man. Here's a man who's only interested in rutabagas. That's all he cares about. He wants to know how to grow them, how to cook them, the genetic background of rutabagas. So he gets up in the morning and he says, okay, what's new about rutabagas? And punches it off on his terminal and learns all more about rutabagas and exchanges conversation about rutabagas with people. And that's all he does. And he gets to do that because he doesn't have to share his information source with anybody. He makes his own informational agenda, he or she. Makes his own informational agenda, which is all well and good. It's a free country. But the rutabaga man has a vote. And somehow, newspapers have to find, newspaper companies, which are badly in economic trouble, have to find a way to transfer the kind of journalism that newspapers historically have done over to this new internet environment that we have. We can do without newspapers in this country. And probably in some of our lifetimes, we're going to do without newspapers in this country. But what we can't do without, and what democracy cannot do without, is the kind of journalism that newspapers traditionally for 200 years in this country did, providing that shared information. We don't have to kill trees to do it. We can do it online. But the question is, the concern I have is whether the owners of the dying newspapers can somehow find a way to sustain good, responsible, democratic-oriented journalism online. And unfortunately, or fortunately, I hope, we're going to be able to find that out. I just hope it turns out well. Thank you.